Cowboy fought off wolves to save 2 Apache girls. Next day, their mother arrived and said she would be his reward. The gunshot echoed across the desert canyon like thunder, but it was the silence that followed that made Ezra Hawthorne's blood run cold. 3 more shots, then screaming. High-pitched, terrified screaming that cut through the New Mexico night like a blade through silk. Most men would have spurred their horses away from such sounds. Most men valued their own skin over whatever nightmare was unfolding in the darkness ahead. But Ezra was not most men. The 30-year-old drifter had seen too much death, caused too much of it himself, to turn his back on someone else's suffering. Not anymore. His weathered hands tightened on the reins as his black stallion, Midnight, snorted nervously beneath him. The horse could smell it too. The metallic scent of blood carried on the desert wind mixed with something else, something wild and hungry. The mesa stretched endlessly in all directions, its red sandstone walls glowing silver under the full moon. Sagebrush and prickly pear dotted the landscape like scattered thoughts, while somewhere in the distance a coyote's lonely cry pierced the air. But this was different. Whatever was happening ahead was no natural desert symphony. Ezra dismounted silently, his spurs barely jingling as his boots touched the rocky ground. He pulled his Winchester rifle from its leather sheath, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing him a strange comfort. The screaming had stopped now, replaced by something far worse, low, guttural growls that made the hair on his neck stand on end. He crept forward, using the scattered boulders as cover, his pale blue eyes scanning the shadows ahead. 20 yards, 15, 10, and then he saw them. 3 wolves, their silver fur matted with blood, circled what remained of a small Apache camp. The canvas shelter had been torn apart, scattered like confetti across the desert floor. Supplies lay strewn everywhere. Blankets, clay pots, strips of dried meat that had attracted the predators in the first place. But it was the 2 small figures huddled behind an overturned wagon that made Ezra's jaw clench with rage. 2 Apache girls, no more than 8 and 10 years old, pressed together like frightened birds. Their dark eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the moonlight as they watched the wolves prowl closer. The older girl held a broken piece of wood in her trembling hands, pathetic protection against 3 hungry predators, each weighing more than she did. Her younger companion had gone completely silent, shock stealing her voice as tears streamed down her dust-stained cheeks. Where were the adults? Ezra's trained eye swept the campsite and found his answer. 2 bodies lay motionless near the remains of a small fire. An elderly Apache man and woman, probably the girl's grandparents, had fought bravely but futilely against the pack. Blood soaked the sand around them, dark and still gleaming wet in the moonlight. The largest wolf, a massive gray beast with yellow eyes like molten gold, took a step closer to the girls. Its lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing fangs that could crush bone. The creature was starving. Ezra could see it in the way its ribs showed through its matted fur, the desperate hunger that had driven it to attack humans instead of staying with its natural prey. This was no ordinary wolf pack. These were desperate animals, pushed to the edge of survival by the harsh desert winter. They would not be frightened away by shouts or thrown rocks. They had tasted blood, and they wanted more. Ezra raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel at the lead wolf. The shot would have to be perfect. One mistake, and the entire pack would scatter, only to return later when he was gone. These children would become their next meal. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, the wind shifted. His scent carried across the campsite, and all 3 wolves turned toward him with predatory focus. Their yellow eyes fixed on his position, and low growls rumbled from their throats like distant thunder. The hunt had just become mutual. The lead wolf abandoned the girls and stalked toward Ezra's hiding place, its massive paws silent on the rocky ground. Behind it, the other 2 wolves spread out, flanking him with the practiced coordination of born killers. They had done this before, surrounded prey, cut off escape routes, moved in for the kill. Ezra's mind raced through his options. 3 shots in his rifle, 3 wolves. No room for error, no second chances. Miss once, and those children would watch him die before suffering the same fate. He steadied his breathing, feeling his heartbeat slow to that familiar rhythm he remembered from his years as a cavalry scout. Time seemed to stretch like taffy as he aimed at the lead wolf, now only 15 feet away and closing fast. The shot rang out like a church bell, echoing off the canyon walls. The massive gray wolf stumbled, a crimson flower blooming on its chest, but it did not fall. Instead, it let out a roar of pain and fury that sent chills racing down Ezra's spine. Wounded animals were the most dangerous of all. The beast charged, its powerful legs eating up the distance between them in heartbeats. Ezra worked the bolt action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. The second wolf was circling wide to his left, while the third moved to cut off his retreat. He fired again. This time the lead wolf dropped, its body sliding across the rocky ground to rest at his feet. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining 2 wolves attacked simultaneously, one from each side, their coordination perfect and deadly. Ezra rolled to his right, avoiding snapping jaws by inches. He felt the wind from the creature's passage ruffle his hair as he brought the rifle around for his third and final shot. The wolf landed hard, turned, and prepared to spring again. The rifle bucked in his hands. The bullet took the wolf's center mass, spinning it around before it collapsed in a heap of silver fur and spreading blood. 2 down, 1 to go. But the third wolf had learned from its packmate's mistakes. Instead of charging blindly, it began to circle, keeping just outside rifle range, waiting for its chance. Its intelligent yellow eyes never left Ezra as it moved, calculating, patient. Ezra's rifle was empty. His Colt revolver hung heavy on his hip, but he would need to get much closer to guarantee a killing shot. And this wolf was not going to give him that opportunity. Behind the overturned wagon, the 2 Apache girls watched in terrified silence. The older one still clutched her piece of wood, but her attention was fixed on the strange white man who had risked his life to save them. She had never seen anyone fight wolves before, had never imagined such courage existed in the world. The remaining wolf feinted left, then right, testing Ezra's reactions. It was looking for weakness, for the moment when exhaustion or fear would create an opening. This was a game it had played many times before, and it almost always won. Ezra slowly reached for his revolver, the movement barely perceptible in the moonlight. The wolf's ears pricked forward, sensing the change in his posture. It crouched lower, muscles coiling like steel springs, preparing to launch itself forward the moment he drew his weapon. The desert held its breath. Even the wind had died away, leaving only the sound of 3 hearts beating in the darkness. Man, wolf, and 2 frightened children who had already seen too much death for one night. Ezra's hand closed around the grip of his Colt. The wolf's eyes narrowed to golden slits. Time balanced on the edge of a knife, waiting for someone to make the first move, and then everything happened at once. The wolf exploded forward just as Ezra's revolver cleared leather. The animal was fast, faster than anything had a right to be, but Ezra had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Every gunfight, every close call, every night spent staring at the stars and wondering if he would see another sunrise had led him to this single crucial second. The Colt roared twice in rapid succession. The first bullet caught the wolf in the shoulder, spinning it sideways. The second punched through its chest, dropping it to the rocky ground where it lay twitching once before going still. Silence settled over the campsite like a heavy blanket. Ezra stood motionless for a long moment, his revolver still smoking in his hand, listening for any sound that might indicate more wolves in the area. But there was nothing. Only the whisper of wind across the desert and the distant cry of a night bird somewhere in the darkness. Slowly, he holstered his weapon and turned toward the overturned wagon where the 2 girls still huddled together. They stared at him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, unsure whether this strange white man was their savior or simply a different kind of threat. Ezra approached carefully, his hands visible and empty. He had dealt with Apache before during his cavalry days, and he knew how important it was to show respect. These people had every reason to distrust white men, and he would not add to their suffering by frightening them further. The older girl spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper in the Apache language. Ezra caught enough of it to understand that she was asking if he meant them harm. He shook his head slowly and spoke in the few Apache words he remembered from his scouting days. His pronunciation was terrible, but the meaning came through. He was a friend. He wanted to help. The younger girl began to cry again, the shock and terror of the night finally overwhelming her small frame. Her sister wrapped protective arms around her, whispering soft words of comfort, even as her own eyes remained fixed on Ezra with watchful caution. Ezra knelt down several feet away, making himself less imposing. Up close, he could see that both girls were injured, scratches on their arms and faces from their desperate flight to safety, torn clothing, cuts on their feet from running across the rocky ground. They needed medical attention, food, and water. But first, they needed to know they were safe. He pointed to himself and spoke his name slowly. Then he gestured to the dead wolves and made a cutting motion across his throat, indicating that the threat was over. The older girl nodded understanding, though she still clutched her makeshift weapon. Looking around the destroyed campsite, Ezra began to piece together what had happened. The elderly couple, probably the girl's grandparents, had been traveling alone with their granddaughters, perhaps moving between seasonal camps or fleeing some other danger. They had made camp in this sheltered spot, thinking themselves safe from both wild animals and hostile humans. The wolves had likely caught the scent of their food supplies and moved in during the night. Apache camps usually posted sentries, but 2 old people and 2 small children would have been no match for a coordinated pack attack. The grandparents had fought bravely, but the outcome had been inevitable from the moment the wolves decided to attack. Ezra stood and began gathering useful supplies from the scattered remains of the camp. A water skin, still mostly full. Some strips of dried meat that the wolves had not yet discovered. A couple of reasonably intact blankets. It was not much, but it would keep the girls alive until he could figure out what to do with them. The nearest Apache settlement was at least 2 days' ride to the south, assuming he could find it. The nearest white town was even farther, and he had no guarantee that the girls would be welcome there. Anti-Indian sentiment ran high in most frontier communities, and 2 Apache children would likely be viewed with suspicion at best. But he could not simply abandon them here. Even if he gave them supplies and directions, 2 young girls would never survive the journey alone. There were too many dangers in the desert, not just wolves and other predators, but rattlesnakes, scorpions, flash floods, and roving bands of outlaws who would view Apache children as either valuable slaves or target practice. No, like it or not, Ezra Hawthorne had just become responsible for 2 lives beyond his own. He returned to the wagon where the girls waited, offering them the water skin. The older girl accepted it gratefully, taking a small sip before helping her younger sister drink. Their eyes never left his face as they shared the precious liquid, still uncertain whether to trust this stranger who had appeared from the darkness like an avenging angel. Ezra settled down cross-legged a respectful distance away and began cleaning his weapons. It was something to do with his hands while he thought, and the familiar routine helped calm his nerves. The metallic clicks and scrapes of the cleaning process seemed to reassure the girls as well. These were sounds that meant safety, preparation, readiness to face whatever dangers might come next. As he worked, Ezra found himself studying the 2 children with growing concern. Beyond their immediate injuries and trauma, they looked too thin for healthy children their age. Their clothes were worn and patched, their moccasins nearly falling apart. These were not the children of a prosperous Apache family, but refugees of some kind. The older girl, he guessed she was about 10, had the sharp, intelligent eyes of someone forced to grow up too quickly. She kept one arm protectively around her younger sister while constantly scanning their surroundings for new threats. Her body language spoke of exhaustion and grief held barely in check. Her sister, perhaps 8 years old, had the hollow look of a child who had seen too much violence. She pressed close to her older sibling for comfort, but her eyes remained distant and unfocused, as if she had retreated somewhere deep inside herself where the wolves could not reach her. Both girls would need time to heal from this night's trauma, but they would also need food, shelter, and medical care that Ezra was not equipped to provide. Every option he considered led to the same conclusion. He needed to find their people and return them to their family as quickly as possible. But first, they all needed rest. The wolves were dead, but their howling might have attracted other predators. Dawn was still several hours away, and traveling in the darkness with 2 injured children would be asking for trouble. Ezra finished cleaning his revolver and looked up to find both girls watching him intently. The older one said something in Apache, her tone questioning. When he looked puzzled, she pointed to the dead wolves, then to him, then made a gesture he did not understand. After a moment of confusion, he realized what she was asking. Why had he helped them? What did he want in return? In her experience, white men did not risk their lives for Apache children without expecting some kind of payment. Ezra struggled to find words that would translate across both language and cultural barriers. Finally, he simply pointed to the girls, then to himself, and made a gesture of protection, arms outstretched, shielding them from harm. Some things, he hoped, needed no translation. The older girl studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden motives. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly and spoke a few quiet words to her sister. For the first time since the attack, the younger girl looked directly at Ezra. Her dark eyes were still haunted with fear, but there was something else there now. A tiny spark of hope that perhaps this nightmare might have an ending that did not involve more death. Ezra pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. 2:30 in the morning. Dawn would not come for at least 4 more hours, and they would need every minute of daylight to make progress toward safety. But they also needed rest if they were going to travel hard tomorrow. He pointed to himself, then to his eyes, then made a circular gesture indicating he would keep watch. The girls could sleep. He would guard them against any new threats. It was a promise he intended to keep, no matter what the cost. The older girl seemed to understand. She gathered the salvaged blankets and helped her sister lie down behind the wagon, using the overturned vehicle as both shelter and concealment. But even as she settled down beside her sibling, her eyes remained open and alert. Trust, Ezra realized, would take time to earn. These children had learned the hard way that safety was an illusion, and that death could strike without warning from the darkness. They would not sleep easily tonight, if at all. He positioned himself where he could watch all approaches to their makeshift camp, his rifle across his knees and his revolver within easy reach. The moon was beginning to set, and soon they would be relying on starlight alone to reveal any approaching dangers. In the growing darkness, Ezra found his thoughts turning to his own past. 10 years ago, he had been a different man, younger, more idealistic, still believing that the world could be divided neatly into good and evil. His service with the cavalry had taught him otherwise. He had seen too many massacres, participated in too many actions that left him sick to his stomach. Women and children cut down alongside warriors, entire villages burned to the ground. Survivors marched off to reservations where they would slowly waste away from disease and despair. The breaking point had come at a place called Crying Woman Creek, where his unit had surrounded a small band of Apache who were trying to reach Mexico. The commanding officer had ordered them to kill everyone, men, women, children, even the horses. When Ezra had refused, he found himself facing a court-martial for disobeying orders. He had escaped before the trial, becoming a deserter and an outlaw in the eyes of the army he had served faithfully for 8 years. Since then, he had drifted from town to town, taking whatever honest work he could find, always moving before his past could catch up with him. Tonight, for the first time in months, he felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that would help heal the wounds he had inflicted rather than deepening them. 2 small lives hung in the balance, and for once, he was on the right side of the equation. A sound from behind the wagon caught his attention. The younger girl was crying again, soft sobs that she tried to muffle against her sister's shoulder. The older girl whispered comfort in Apache, but Ezra could hear the exhaustion in her voice as well. They were both thinking about their grandparents, he realized, processing the grief and trauma of losing the only family they had left in the world. Tomorrow they would have to face the reality that they were alone, orphaned in a desert that showed no mercy to the weak or helpless, unless he could find their people. Unless there was still family somewhere who would take them in and care for them. It was a slim hope, but it was all they had. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small human drama playing out below. Ezra checked his watch again. 3:15. Time crawled like honey in winter, each minute stretching into an eternity of vigilant waiting. But gradually, the sounds from behind the wagon grew quieter. Exhaustion had finally overcome fear, and both girls had fallen into the deep sleep that only children could achieve even in the worst circumstances. Their breathing grew slow and regular, occasionally interrupted by small whimpers as nightmares visited their dreams. Ezra remained motionless, every sense alert for signs of danger. His body ached from the fight with the wolves, and fatigue pressed against his consciousness like a physical weight. But he had made a promise, and he would keep it. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, he allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They had survived the night. The girls were alive and relatively unharmed. Now all they had to do was find their way to safety before the desert heat made travel impossible. But even as he made plans for the journey ahead, a nagging worry gnawed at the back of his mind. Wolf attacks on human camps were rare, especially organized pack attacks like the one he had witnessed. Something had driven these predators to desperate measures, and he suspected that same something might pose a threat to his small party as well. The desert was vast and unforgiving, but it was also home to other dangers besides wolves. Outlaw bands, rogue cavalry patrols, bounty hunters, claim jumpers, and worse roamed these empty spaces, preying on the weak and isolated. 2 Apache girls would be valuable commodities to the wrong people, either as slaves or as bait to draw their relatives into ambushes. Ezra's jaw tightened with determination. Whatever dangers lay ahead, he would face them. These children had already lost too much. He would not let them lose their lives as well. Behind him, the older girl stirred in her sleep and murmured something in Apache. The word sounded like a name, probably calling for her grandparents in dreams, where they still lived and the wolves had never come. Dawn was coming, bringing both hope and new challenges. Soon they would have to leave this place of death and begin the journey toward an uncertain future. But for now, in these last moments of darkness, they were safe. And that, Ezra told himself, was enough. The first rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, transforming the harsh desert landscape into something almost beautiful, almost peaceful, if you could ignore the 3 dead wolves and 2 human bodies that marked this place as a scene of violence. Ezra stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of motionless vigilance. His back ached, his eyes burned from the strain of watching shadows, and his throat felt like sandpaper. But he was alive, and more importantly, so were the girls. Behind the overturned wagon, both children were beginning to stir. The older girl, he really needed to learn their names, sat up first, her dark hair tangled and her clothes rumpled from sleep. For a moment, confusion clouded her features as she took in their surroundings. Then memory crashed back like a physical blow, and grief darkened her eyes. She looked toward where her grandparents lay and spoke a single word in Apache that needed no translation. It was the sound of a heart breaking. The younger girl woke to find her sister crying and immediately began to weep as well, though Ezra suspected she did not fully understand why. At 8 years old, death was still an abstract concept, present one moment, gone the next, without the permanence that adults understood all too well. Ezra approached them carefully, moving slowly so as not to startle them in their vulnerable state. He had salvaged what food and water he could find, but it would not last long in the desert heat. They needed to start moving soon if they were going to cover any significant distance before the sun made travel impossible. The older girl wiped her eyes and spoke to him in halting English, her accent thick but her words clear enough to understand. "You white man, why you help us?" Ezra considered how to answer such a direct question. The truth was complicated, tangled up with his own guilt and desire for redemption. But children deserved simple honesty, not adult complications. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "Because it was the right thing to do." She studied his face with those sharp, intelligent eyes, looking for deception. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "I am Ainana," she said, touching her chest. Then she gestured to her younger sister. "This is Helona. Our grandfather was Nanton. Grandmother was Desba." The names hit Ezra like physical blows. He had heard of Nanton, an Apache leader who had refused to be herded onto the reservations, choosing instead to live free in the traditional way. The army had been hunting him for years, offering increasingly large rewards for his capture or death. If these were Nanton's granddaughters, then their situation was even more dangerous than Ezra had imagined. There would be bounty hunters looking for them, cavalry patrols hoping to use them as bait, and Apache warriors trying to protect them. They were valuable pawns in a game much larger than themselves. "Where is your mother?" Ezra asked gently. "Your father?" Ayana's expression darkened. "Father killed by bluecoats 2 winters ago. Mother ... She paused, struggling with the English words. "Mother sick, very sick. She sent us with grandparents to find medicine plants in sacred places." The pieces began to fall into place. A dying mother, desperate grandparents willing to risk everything for traditional remedies, 2 children caught in the middle of forces beyond their control. No wonder they looked so thin and worn. They had been living as refugees for months, maybe years. "Where is your mother now?" Ezra pressed. Ayana pointed southwest, toward a range of distant mountains barely visible on the horizon. 3 days' walk, maybe 4. In hidden place by water. 3 days for healthy adults traveling light. At least 5 or 6 days with 2 exhausted children, assuming they could even find the location. And that was assuming the woman was still alive when they got there. Ezra made his decision. He could not simply abandon these girls, but he also could not wander the desert indefinitely looking for a hidden Apache camp. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to take them to the nearest town and let someone else deal with the problem. But looking at Ayana's proud, desperate face, he knew he could never do that. These children had already lost their father and grandparents. Their mother was dying in some remote canyon, waiting for medicine that would never come. They deserved better than to become wards of white people who would never understand their culture or their pain. "Can you find this place?" he asked. "Your mother's camp?" Ayana nodded firmly. "Grandfather teach me, I remember." "Then that is where we will go." Relief flooded the girl's features, followed immediately by worry. "Is far, very dangerous. You do, you not have to." Ezra knelt down to her level, meeting her eyes directly. "Your grandfather and grandmother died protecting you. That makes you family to me now. Family does not abandon family." It was a simple declaration, but it carried the weight of a sacred oath. In Apache culture, as in most frontier societies, family bonds were everything. They defined who you were, what you owed, and what was owed to you. By declaring himself family, Ezra was accepting responsibility not just for their immediate safety, but for their entire future. Ayanna seemed to understand the gravity of his words. She spoke rapidly to her sister in Apache, explaining what the strange white man had promised. Alona's eyes widened, and she looked at Ezra with something approaching wonder. She asked, She asked if you are warrior spirit, Ayanna translated. She say only spirits fight like you fight wolves. Ezra almost smiled at that. If only the child knew how many mistakes he had made, how many wrong choices littered his past like broken glass. But perhaps that was exactly why he was here, not as some perfect hero, but as a flawed man trying to do something right for once in his life. Tell her I am just a man, he said. But sometimes, when it matters most, men can do impossible things. While Ayanna translated, Ezra began gathering supplies for the journey ahead. His horse could carry extra water on the girls when they grew too tired to walk. He had enough ammunition to deal with most threats they might encounter. Food would be scarce, but Apache children were raised to survive on very little when necessary. The real challenge would be finding their destination. 3 or 4 days in a particular direction was not much to go on in a landscape, where every canyon looked the same and landmarks could be obscured by heat shimmer or dust storms. One wrong turn could lead them into waterless waste where they would die of thirst before they could correct their mistake. But Ayanna seemed confident she could guide them, and Apache children learned navigation skills from infancy. If anyone could find a hidden camp in this vast wilderness, it would be the granddaughter of a man who had evaded the entire United States Army for years. As they prepared to leave, Ezra took one last look at the campsite where so much had changed in a single night. The wolves lay where they had fallen, their silver fur already drawing flies in the growing heat. The elderly Apache couple rested side by side, their faces peaceful now in death. He should bury them, but there was no time and no tools for proper graves. The desert would claim them soon enough, scattering their bones until nothing remained but memories. In Apache tradition, the dead were quickly forgotten, their names never spoken again lest their spirits linger instead of moving on to the next world. But Ezra would remember. He would carry the weight of their sacrifice, the knowledge that they had died protecting their granddaughters. It was a burden he willingly accepted. Ayanna helped her sister climb onto Midnight's broad back, then swung up behind her with the easy grace of someone born to horses. Apache children learned to ride almost before they could walk, and both girls looked more comfortable on horseback than they had on the ground. Ezra adjusted the stirrups and checked the saddle, making sure both children were secure. Then he took the reins and began leading the horse southwest, toward the distant mountains where a dying mother waited for daughters who might never return. The sun climbed higher, painting the desert in harsh whites and deep shadows. Already the temperature was rising, and by midday it would be unbearable. They would need to find shelter and rest until evening, then travel through the night when the desert was cooler and more forgiving. But for now, they moved through a landscape that seemed carved from raw beauty and endless danger. Red sandstone mesas rose like ancient cathedrals from the desert floor. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, their massive arms reaching toward the cloudless sky. In the distance, dust devils danced across the flats like ghostly dancers celebrating some primordial ritual. It was a land that tested every man who entered it, that separated the strong from the weak with ruthless efficiency. Many would die in these empty spaces before their story was finished. But some, the lucky, the determined, the blessed, would find what they were looking for. Ezra hoped they would be among the fortunate ones. Behind him, the girls rode in silence, lost in their own thoughts and grief. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and quite possibly death. But also hope, the chance that somewhere in those distant mountains, a mother still lived and waited for her children to come home. And for the first time in years, Ezra Hawthorne felt like he was walking towards something instead of running away from it, The feeling was strange, unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Perhaps redemption was possible after all. The desert stretched endlessly before them, keeping its secrets and testing their resolve with every step. But they would not turn back, could not turn back. Too much depended on their success, and failure was not an option they could afford to consider. As the sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, a small group of travelers moved deeper into the wasteland, carrying hope and determination like precious cargo through a landscape that had crushed stronger men than they. Behind them, the dead wolves watched with glassy eyes as their killers disappeared into the heat shimmer, bound for a destiny none of them could foresee. The second day of their journey began with vultures. Ezra counted at least a dozen of the black-winged scavengers circling high above a ridge to their east, their patient spirals marking death somewhere in the maze of canyons below. In this merciless landscape, carrion birds were as common as sunrise, but something about their behavior made the hair on his neck prickle with unease. They were circling too low, too concentrated. Whatever had died down there was fresh, and there was a lot of it. Ayanna noticed his attention and followed his gaze skyward. Her young face hardened with understanding that no 10-year-old should possess. She had learned to read the desert signs of death as easily as other children learned their letters. "Horses," she said quietly. "Many horses. Maybe soldiers." Behind her, little Helona stirred restlessly on Midnight's broad back, still half asleep in the growing heat. The child had barely spoken since they left the wolf-torn campsite, retreating into some inner sanctuary where the horrors of recent days could not touch her. Ezra worried about that silence, but there was nothing he could do except keep moving and pray they reached her mother in time. They had covered good ground through the cool desert night, following game trails and dry washes that Ayanna navigated with the inherited wisdom of her people. The girl possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the landscape, finding water sources and safe passages that would have been invisible to white eyes. But each mile took them deeper into territory where Apache raiders and cavalry patrols played their deadly game of cat and mouse. The vultures continued their ominous dance as Ezra led Midnight up a rocky slope toward a grove of ancient cottonwoods that promised shade and possibly water. His throat felt like sandpaper, and the girls needed rest before the sun climbed high enough to kill unwary travelers. But first, he wanted a better view of whatever had attracted those scavengers. At the crest of the ridge, the mystery resolved itself in a tableau of violence that made even Ezra's battle-hardened stomach lurch. Below them, scattered across a dry creek bed, lay the remains of a cavalry patrol. 8 soldiers and their mounts, cut down in what must have been a brief but savage engagement. The bodies had been stripped of weapons and anything valuable, but left otherwise unmolested. This was Apache work, efficient, brutal, and pointed. Someone was sending a message to any other bluecoats foolish enough to enter this territory. "Nanton's warriors," Ayanna said with quiet pride. "They protect the sacred places." Ezra studied the scene with a soldier's eye, reading the story written in blood and scattered equipment. The patrol had been caught in the open, probably while following a false trail. They never had a chance to form up or find cover. It was the kind of tactical masterpiece that had made Nanton's name a legend among both his own people and his enemies. But it also meant they were close to Apache territory now, entering the maze of hidden canyons where Nanton's band made their homes. One wrong step, one misunderstood gesture, and Ezra could find himself facing the same fate as those soldiers below. The irony was not lost on him. He had deserted from the very army whose dead now fed the vultures, abandoning his uniform to avoid participating in the kind of massacre that had created this scene. Now he traveled under Apache protection, guided by the granddaughter of their greatest war leader, seeking to reunite a shattered family. Life, he reflected, had a twisted sense of humor. They found water in a spring-fed pool beneath the cottonwoods, the precious liquid crystal clear and sweet with mountain snowmelt. Ezra let the girls drink first, then filled every container they possessed. Water was life in the desert, and they could not afford to take chances with their supply. While the children rested in the dappled shade, Ezra kept watch from a position that commanded views in all directions. The dead cavalry patrol worried him more than he cared to admit. If Apache war parties were active in the area, their small group might be caught in the crossfire between hunting warriors and pursuing soldiers. But there was no turning back now. Somewhere ahead, probably no more than a day's travel, a dying Apache woman waited for daughters who carried her only hope of seeing another sunrise. Ezra had made his choice when he declared himself family to these children, and he would see it through regardless of the cost. As the sun reached its brutal zenith, transforming the desert into a furnace of white heat and dancing mirages, they took shelter in a shallow cave Ayanna discovered among the rocks. The girl had an uncanny ability to find these hidden refuges, places where ancient peoples had once sheltered from the same pitiless sun. Inside the cave, primitive paintings decorated the walls, hunters pursuing deer, warriors counting coup, women gathering plants by flowing streams. These images spoke of a time when the desert had been gentler, when game was plentiful and water flowed year-round in streams that were now cracked earth. Alona traced one of the paintings with her small finger, a woman holding two children close to her breast. For the first time in days she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emma," she said in Apache. "Mother." Ayanna's eyes filled with tears she refused to shed. She gathered her little sister close, whispering comfort in their native tongue while staring at the painted figures with desperate longing. These children had endured too much loss already: the death of their father, the separation from their dying mother, the brutal murder of their grandparents. How much could young hearts bear before they simply stopped beating? Ezra pretended not to notice their grief, giving them space to mourn while he cleaned his weapons and checked their supplies. They had enough water for another day, maybe two if they were careful. Food was running low, but Apache children were accustomed to hunger. They would survive until they reached their destination. If they reached their destination, the thought nagged at him as he dozed fitfully in the cave's stifling heat. What if the dying woman had already passed? What if their desperate journey led only to another grave, another loss for children who had already suffered beyond measure? What would he do then with two orphaned Apache girls in the middle of hostile territory? But such thoughts served no purpose except to breed despair. He pushed them away and focused on immediate concerns: route selection, water conservation, the ever-present danger of discovery by hostile forces. One step at a time, 1 mile at a time, until they either found what they sought or died trying. Evening brought blessed relief from the heat, and they resumed their journey as shadows began to lengthen across the desert floor. Ayanna guided them through a landscape that grew increasingly rugged and broken, following paths that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. This was the true Apache stronghold, a maze of canyons, mesas, and hidden valleys where a small band could vanish like smoke, emerging only to strike at enemies before disappearing again into the labyrinth. The army had been hunting Natin in these badlands for years without success, and now Ezra understood why. This was not territory you conquered with conventional tactics and superior numbers. This was a place that demanded respect, patience, and the kind of intimate knowledge that came only from being born to it. As full darkness fell, they began to encounter signs that they were no longer alone. Smoke from carefully concealed fires drifted on the night breeze. The distant sound of horses moving across stone echoed from canyon walls. Most ominously, they began to see signal fires flickering from mountaintops, the ancient Apache communication system that could carry messages across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. They knew strangers were in their territory now. The only question was whether those strangers would be allowed to continue their journey or would simply disappear into the desert night, their fate forever unknown. Ayanna seemed to sense the changed atmosphere as well. She rode with new tension in her small frame, her eyes constantly scanning the shadows for movement. But there was no fear in her posture, only alertness and a growing excitement that suggested they were nearing their goal. "Close now," she said as they paused to rest the horse beside a trickling stream. Maybe few hours more. Ezra hoped she was right. His nerves were stretched taut as piano wire, and every shadow seemed to conceal a warrior with a drawn bow. He had faced death many times in his life, but never while responsible for two children whose lives depended on his vigilance and judgment. They were following what appeared to be a game trail up a narrow canyon when the first Apache warrior stepped into their path. He materialized from the darkness like a ghost, one moment absent, the next simply there, a tall, lean man with traditional war paint striping his bronze features. His rifle was held casually but ready, and his dark eyes missed nothing as they evaluated the strange group before him. Behind him, Ezra sensed rather than saw at least 3 more warriors positioned to cut off any retreat. They had walked into a carefully prepared ambush, and their survival now depended entirely on Ayana's ability to convince these men that they belonged here. The girl slipped down from the horse with fluid grace, approaching the warrior with her hands visible and empty. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her young voice carrying the authority of noble blood and desperate need. Ezra caught fragments of her words, references to Nanton, to her mother's illness, to the long journey they had undertaken. The warrior listened impassively, his painted features revealing nothing. When Ayana finished speaking, he replied in tones too low for Ezra to hear. Whatever he said made the girl's face light up with joy and relief. She turned back to Ezra with tears streaming down her cheeks. He say, mother still live. She wait for us. She ... The child's English failed her in the overwhelming rush of emotion, but her meaning was clear. They had made it. Against all odds, through danger and death and the pitiless desert heat, they had found their way to safety. The dying woman still lived, still waited for her daughters to return with the medicine that might save her life. But even as relief flooded through him, Ezra noticed that the Apache warrior's attention had shifted to him. Those dark eyes studied his face, his weapons, his manner with the calculating gaze of a professional killer. Whatever welcome awaited the children, his own reception remained very much in doubt. The warrior spoke again, his tone sharp with challenge. Ayana's face fell as she translated his words. He asked why white man come to sacred place. He asked if you are spy, if you bring soldiers. It was the question Ezra had been dreading, the moment when his past might catch up with him in the most literal and final way possible. These warriors would have no mercy for a man they perceived as an enemy, regardless of what good deeds he might have performed. One wrong word, one suspicious gesture, and he would join the cavalry patrol as food for vultures. But before he could frame a response, little Helena surprised everyone by speaking up. Her voice was still weak and tremulous, but her words carried the clarity of absolute truth. She told them about the wolves, about how the strange white man had appeared from the darkness like an avenging spirit to save them when death seemed certain, about how he had fought the pack with no thought for his own safety, risking everything for 2 Apache children he had never seen before. Her sister picked up the story, adding details about their grandfather's last words, about the promise Ezra had made to see them safely home. Between them, the 2 girls painted a picture of selfless heroism that even hardened warriors could not dismiss. The lead warrior's expression began to soften as he listened to their testimony. When they finished speaking, he studied Ezra with new eyes, no longer seeing a potential enemy, but a man who had proven his worth through actions rather than words. Finally, he spoke again, and this time there was something approaching respect in his voice. Ayana translated with visible relief. He say, you have warrior's heart. He say, any man who fight wolves to save Apache children is welcome in our hidden places. The tension that had been building like a storm finally began to dissipate. The other warriors emerged from concealment, lowering their weapons in gestures of acceptance if not quite friendship. They were still wary of the white stranger, but they would honor their leader's judgment. One of them, a younger man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, approached Midnight with obvious appreciation for horseflesh. He spoke to Ayana, who smiled for the first time in days as she translated. "He say your horse is strong, like Mountain Bear. He ask if you trade for 3 ponies and rifle." Despite everything, Ezra found himself chuckling. Even in the face of life and death, Apache traders never missed an opportunity to negotiate. "Tell him maybe later. Right now, I think we should see your mother." The lead warrior nodded and gestured for them to follow. They moved deeper into the canyon, following a path that seemed to exist more by memory than design. The walls closed in around them until they were walking through a narrow slot barely wide enough for a horse, with only a thin strip of stars visible overhead. Just when Ezra began to worry they might be trapped in this stone passage, the canyon opened into a hidden valley that took his breath away. A natural amphitheater perhaps half a mile across, surrounded by towering cliffs that made it invisible from the outside. A clear stream wound through the center, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the far wall in silver ribbons. But it was not the natural beauty that made him stare in wonder. It was the sight of an entire Apache community hidden in this secret place. Dozens of traditional shelters scattered along the stream, horses grazing in meadows that should not have existed in the middle of the desert, children playing games that had been old when Columbus landed in the New World. This was Nanton's stronghold, the place from which he had defied the United States Army for years. No wonder they had never been able to find him. This hidden valley was perfectly concealed, easily defended, and supplied with everything needed to support a small community indefinitely. As they entered the village, Apache men, women, and children gathered to watch their arrival. Many stared openly at Ezra, clearly wondering what business a white man might have in their sanctuary. But their attention quickly shifted to Ayana and Helona, and suddenly the night air filled with cries of joy and recognition. The girls had family here, aunts, uncles, cousins who had feared them lost forever. Eager hands reached up to help them down from the horse, and they were immediately surrounded by a crowd of relatives asking rapid questions in Apache. But even in the midst of this joyous reunion, Ezra could see the shadow that hung over the celebration. These people were glad to have the children back, but they knew why they had been sent away in the first place. Somewhere in this hidden valley, a woman lay dying, and her daughters had returned too late to save her. Or had they? An elderly Apache woman pushed through the crowd, her weathered face grave with authority and concern. She examined both girls carefully, checking for injuries or signs of illness, then spoke briefly to the lead warrior who had brought them here. After hearing his report, she turned to Ezra with eyes that seemed to look straight through to his soul. When she spoke, her English was heavily accented, but perfectly clear. "You are the one who saved granddaughters of Nanton from Wolfpack." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Somehow, word of their encounter had already reached this hidden place, carried by the mysterious Apache communication network that could outpace any horse. "I did what anyone should have done," Ezra replied carefully. The old woman's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Not anyone. Many white men would have ridden away. You stayed. You fought. You brought children home when we feared them lost forever." She paused, studying his face with the intensity of someone reading an important document. "I am Nalnish, medicine woman of our people. Ayana tells me you seek no reward for your deed. The children's safety is reward enough. Perhaps, but Apache people do not forget debts of honor. You have earned place by our fires, protection of our warriors. What would you ask of us?" It was an extraordinary offer. To be granted sanctuary by Nanton's band would mean safety from pursuing cavalry, protection from bounty hunters, acceptance into a community that had successfully defied the might of the United States government for years. But even as the offer tempted him, Ezra knew he could not accept it. This was not his world, not his fight. He was a man caught between two peoples, belonging fully to neither. His place was on the trail, moving always toward some horizon that remained forever just out of reach. "I ask only to see that the girls are reunited with their mother," he said. "After that, I will go my own way." Nalnish nodded as if she had expected this answer. "Come then. Sakura waits for her daughters." "She has waited long time." They followed the medicine woman through the village, past curious stares and whispered conversations. The traditional Apache shelters were works of art in their own right, wickiups, constructed from carefully bent branches and covered with hides or canvas, each one perfectly adapted to the desert environment. But it was the largest structure, positioned at the center of the village near the stream, that drew Ezra's attention. This was clearly the home of someone important, larger than the others, decorated with symbols that spoke of spiritual power and tribal authority. As they approached, Ayana and Halona began to tremble with a mixture of excitement and fear. They had traveled hundreds of miles through deadly danger to reach this moment, but now that it was here, they seemed almost afraid to complete their journey. What if their mother had grown worse during their absence? What if the medicine they had sought in the sacred places was no longer enough to save her? What if they had returned only to watch her die? Nalnish seemed to sense their hesitation. She knelt down to their level, speaking softly in Apache while placing gentle hands on their shoulders. Whatever she said gave them courage, because they both straightened and walked toward the shelter with new determination. The medicine woman pulled aside the entrance flap and gestured for them to enter. Ayana went first, followed closely by her little sister. Ezra hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether his presence would be welcome at such an intimate family moment. But Nalnish took his arm and guided him inside, her actions making it clear that he was expected to witness whatever happened next. The interior of the shelter was dimly lit by a small fire burning in a central hearth. Smoke drifted upward through an opening in the roof, carrying with it the scent of burning sage and other medicinal herbs. Traditional Apache furnishings lined the walls, sleeping furs, woven baskets, weapons, and ceremonial objects that spoke of a rich cultural heritage. But Ezra's attention was immediately drawn to the figure lying on a bed of soft furs near the fire. She was young, perhaps 25, with the kind of classic Apache beauty that had inspired countless songs and stories. But illness had taken its toll, leaving her face gaunt and her breathing shallow and labored. This was Sakura, daughter of the legendary Nanton, mother of the two brave children who had risked everything to find medicine for her failing health. As her daughters approached her bedside, her dark eyes fluttered open and filled with tears of joy so pure they seemed to light the entire shelter. "My daughters," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible but carrying all the love in the world. "You have come home." What happened next would be burned into Ezra's memory for the rest of his life. The two girls flew to their mother's side, careful not to jar her weakened body, but desperate to feel her embrace. Tears flowed freely as they spoke in rapid Apache, telling her of their adventures, their fears, their desperate journey to reach her side. But even in his joy at witnessing this reunion, Ezra could see that Sakura was fading fast. The effort of staying alive until her daughters returned had drained her remaining strength, and now that they were safely home, her body was finally giving up its fight. She seemed to sense this as well, because she gestured weakly for Nalnish to approach. The two women spoke in low tones while the children clung to their mother's hands, as if their touch alone could anchor her to the world of the living. Then Sakura's gaze found Ezra where he stood respectfully near the entrance. With tremendous effort, she raised one hand and beckoned him closer. "You," she said in careful English, "you are the one who saved my daughters." Ezra approached her bedside, hat in hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him like a heavy cloak. "Yes, ma'am, I was glad to help." Sakura studied his face with eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom far beyond her years. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone making a decision that would echo through generations. "Apache law is ancient law. Life debt must be repaid. You have given me greatest gift, my daughters alive and safe. I have little to offer in return, but what I have is yours." She paused to gather strength, her breathing becoming more labored with each word. But her eyes never left his face as she continued, "I give you my most precious possession. I give you myself." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. Around the shelter, he could hear the sharp intake of breath from watching relatives. Even by Apache standards, this was an extraordinary gesture, a dying woman offering herself in marriage to repay a life debt. But before he could protest, before he could explain that such sacrifice was unnecessary, Sakura continued speaking. "I am dying. This we both know. But Apache law does not recognize death as ending obligation. My spirit will watch over you always. My daughters will call you father. My people will call you brother. This is my gift to you, family that will never abandon you, never betray you, never forget what you have done." She gestured weakly to Nalnish, who stepped forward with something in her weathered hands. It was a necklace of silver and turquoise, worked in the traditional Apache style, but clearly of great value and significance. "This belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before her. It marks you as family, as protector of my children. Wear it with honor, white warrior. Wear it knowing that you have earned place among the people." Ezra found himself speechless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. He had saved 2 children from wolves, nothing more. He did not deserve such recognition, such acceptance, such trust. But as he looked down at Sakura's face, he saw something there that stopped his protests before they could form. This was not just about repaying a debt or following ancient law. This was a dying mother's desperate attempt to ensure her children would be protected, loved, and guided after she was gone. By accepting her offer, he would become more than their guardian. He would become their father in every way that mattered, bound by ties stronger than blood to watch over them and keep them safe. It was a responsibility that would change his life forever, but one he suddenly realized he wanted more than anything else in the world. With reverent hands, he accepted the necklace and placed it around his neck. The silver felt warm against his skin, as if it carried the accumulated love and protection of generations of Apache mothers. "I accept your gift," he said solemnly. "I swear by all I hold sacred that your daughters will be safe, loved, and honored. This I promise on my life." Sakura's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire shelter. For a moment, the ravages of illness fell away, and Ezra caught a glimpse of the vibrant young woman she had been before tragedy and disease claimed her. "Then I can rest," she whispered. "My children have father. My debt is paid. My spirit can fly free." She turned to her daughters, speaking to them one final time in the Apache tongue. Her words were too soft for Ezra to hear, but he could see their effect on the children. Both girls were crying, but there was acceptance in their tears now, and even a strange kind of peace. Their mother was dying, but she was not leaving them alone. She had found them a protector, a man who had already proven his courage and devotion. They would grieve, but they would also survive and flourish under his care. As the night wore on, Sakura's breathing grew increasingly shallow, but she did not seem to be in pain. Instead, there was a serenity about her that suggested she was finally at peace with whatever waited beyond the veil of death. Near dawn, surrounded by her daughters and the man she had chosen to replace her as their guardian, Sakura closed her eyes for the last time. Her passing was so gentle that for a moment no one realized she was gone. Only the stillness of her chest revealed that her spirit had finally taken flight. In the Apache tradition, there was little time for elaborate grieving. The dead were honored briefly and then forgotten, their names never spoken again lest their spirits be prevented from moving on to the next world. But the living had to continue, and life's demands waited for no one. By the time the sun cleared the canyon rim, Sakura's body had been prepared for burial according to ancient custom. Her personal possessions would be burned or buried with her, ensuring that nothing remained to tie her spirit to the world of the living. But her final gift, the adoption of Ezra into her family would endure for generations. He was no longer a drifting gunfighter with no ties or obligations. He was father to 2 Apache daughters, brother to an entire community, protector of ancient traditions and sacred trusts. It was not the life he had planned when he rode away from that wolf-torn campsite 3 days ago. But as he watched Ayanna and Halona prepare for their mother's funeral with the stoic courage that was their birthright, he realized it was exactly the life he needed. The desert had tested him and found him worthy. The wolves had made him a killer, but love had made him a father. And in this hidden valley, surrounded by people who had accepted him despite every reason for suspicion and hatred, Ezra Hawthorne finally understood what it meant to come home.